very pleased to welcome you to this continuing series of public lectures that we have monthly during the academic year at the Science Center. This evening's speaker ranks very high among Harvard's most eminent scholars and finest teachers. He's one of the world's leading entomologists, and this subject has fascinated him since early his high school days, when he began to work on ants, and work that was to become classic. This intense specialization on social insects, plus a natural interest in evolutionary synthesis, led him to broader research in other fields of biology and to contributions involving diverse topics in ecology and behavioral biology. He gave decisive shape to the discipline of sociobiology, which involves the extension of population biology and the evolutionary theory to the social structure of all organisms. The importance of this field was underlined when he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in 1979 for his book on human nature. His professional accomplishments have been widely recognized. He was awarded the National Medal of Science by President Carter in 1977, and honorary degrees from Duke University, Grinnell College, and several other universities. He has been elected to a number of prestigious professional societies, among them the National Academy of Sciences, and has been the recipient of several awards and prizes. He has written over 200 papers and 8 books. His most recent book, Genes, Mind, and Culture, whose co-author is C.J. Lumsden, was published in 1981. It contains some of the ideas that are the subject of tonight's lecture. At Harvard, Professor Wilson has been Frank Baird Jr. Professor of Science since 1976 and the teacher of the popular core course Science B15, Evolutionary Biology, which continues to receive critical acclaim from the many students who've had the privilege of taking it. It's a pleasure and an honor for me to introduce Professor E.O. Wilson, who will speak on the co-evolution of genes and culture. Professor Wilson.
Thank you. Professor Ehrenreich, Mrs. Ehrenreich, former members of Science B15, colleagues, members of the radical left who hope to ask me embarrassing questions, and other fun seekers. I suppose I ought to say something about the demonstration around the lecture hall tonight. It has to be pretty wide of the mark. I won't be talking about race or racism. Quite the contrary, I'm going to be describing unifying qualities of the human species. And the demonstration can't have much to do with me personally, because racists on the Harvard faculty are about as common as atheists in a Benedictine monastery. But in any case, Harvard owes me a debt for recapturing tonight a little bit of the atmosphere of the 1960s for your delectation. I think only a showing of the movie Hair could have done better. Let me begin the main topic with a couple of special prefatory remarks. First, will not be describing my life's work as suggested by Harvard Magazine, but only the last 3 years of hard and sometimes frustrating work. And second, this presentation ought to be considered to have 2 authors. My co-worker is Charles Lumsden, who's about to leave for an associate professorship at the University of Toronto Medical School after a remarkable period of accomplishment at Harvard. Charles' expertise in a wide range of subjects from statistical mechanics to neurobiology to cognitive psychology is unique and in fact has made this whole enterprise that I'm about to describe possible. I believe that tonight's subject can be put in proper perspective by quoting Jean Brulaire, also known as Vercors, from his remarkable book, You Shall Know Them. He said, "All of man's troubles arise from the fact that we do not know what we are and do not agree on what we want to become." I'm going to use an unusual device to emphasize and define more precisely that ultimate dilemma. Consider, if you will, the world of the tropical termite living in deep subterranean nest. The colony consists of a single mated pair, the king and queen. I think there's a switch on this thing somewhere. Oh, yes, down here. Thank you. Laser, ruby laser, won't hurt you unless it contacts your skin. King and queen, and up to 1 million or more of their offspring, which are sterile males and females. The colony members are wholly altruistic to each other, but they're absolutely hostile to termites from other colonies. They communicate almost entirely by means of pheromones or chemical substances secreted to the outside of the body and smelled or tasted by nestmates who then act on them as signals. After the termites shed their skin, which they do periodically in growth, they pick up symbiotic cellulose-digesting microorganisms by feeding on anal droplets provided by other colony members. Injured and sick colony members are promptly killed and eaten by their nestmates to conserve nitrogen. A lot of other qualities of termite social life exist that appear bizarre to us, hence the interest in the social insects generally. Imagine now what it would be like if a termite species had evolved in the late Mesozoic to achieve high intelligence. Imagine further, if you'll indulge me for just a moment, a convocation in a termite university. The dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences makes the following statement, responding to Termito Vercors' challenge that we do not know what we are and do not agree on what we wish to be. He says, "On one thing we can surely agree. We are the pinnacle of 3 billion years of evolution on Earth, unique by virtue of our high intelligence, employment of symbolic language, and diversity of cultures evolved over hundreds of generations. Our species alone has sufficient self-awareness to perceive history and the meaning of personal mortality. Having largely escaped the sovereignty of our genes, we now base social organization mostly or entirely upon culture. Our universities disseminate knowledge from the 3 great branches of learning, the natural sciences, the social sciences, and the termitities. Since our ancestors, the macrotermitine termites, achieved 10-kilogram weight and larger brains during their rapid evolution through the late tertiary period and learned to write with pheromone script, termitistic scholarship has refined ethical philosophy. It is now possible to express the deontological imperatives of moral behavior with precision. These imperatives are mostly self-evident and universal, of course. They are the very essence of termitity. They include the love of darkness and of the deep saprophytic, basidiomycetic penetralia of the soil. The centrality of colony life amidst the richness of war and trade among colonies, the sanctity of the physiological caste system, the evil of personal reproduction by worker caste, how revolting the very thought, the mystery of deep love for reproductive siblings, which turns to hatred the instant they mate, rejection of the evil of personal rights, the infinite aesthetic experience of pheromonal song, the exquisite pleasure of eating from nestmates' anuses after the shedding of the skin, the joy of cannibalism and surrender of one's own body for consumption when sick or injured. It is more blessed to be eaten than to eat, and much more. Some termitistically inclined scientists, particularly the ethologist and sociobiologist, argue that our social organization is shaped by our genes and that our ethical precepts simply reflect the peculiarities of termite evolution. They assert that ethical philosophy must take into account the structure of the termite brain and the evolutionary history of the species. Socialization is genetically channeled, and some forms of it all but inevitable. This proposal has created a major academic controversy. An organization calling itself Science for the Termites has protested. The International Committee Against Caste Equality has called for the burning of books and the eating of the authors. Many scholars in the social sciences and termitides, refusing to believe that termite nature can be better understood by a study of such creatures as fishes and baboons, have withdrawn behind the moat of philosophical dualism and reinforced the crenellated parapets of the formal refutation of the naturalistic fallacy. They consider the mind to be beyond the reach of materialistic biological research. A few take the extreme view that conditioning can alter termite culture and ethics in almost any direction desired. But the biologists respond that termite behavior can never be altered so far as to resemble that of, say, Lucifer forbid, human beings. There is such a thing as a biologically based termite nature. The dean steps down. Well, I've concocted this termitocentric fantasy to illustrate a generalization strangely difficult to explain by conventional means. That human beings possess a species-specific nature and morality which occupy only a tiny section in the space of all possible moral and ethical and social conditions. Now I'm going to make one more provocative statement before getting on with it. In the same way that physics and chemistry modernized biology and moved it onto center stage in the past 30 years, I predict that biology is about to greatly augment the social sciences and move them onto center stage. The principal obstacle in this enterprise is the unknown relation between the genes and culture. But of course, when one uses the phrase an unknown relation, he means that it's a puzzle to be solved. And in my opinion, it's indeed one of the great remaining problems of science. I think it's tractable and ready to be broken open. A good many philosophers and scientists still talk about a permanent discontinuity between the biological sciences and the social sciences, grounded in epistemology, ensured by a fundamental difference in goals on the part of specialists. But Lumsden and I have come to see the gap as a largely unknown evolutionary process, a complicated and fascinating interaction in which culture is generated by biological process while biological traits are simultaneously altered by genetic evolution in response to cultural innovation. So the substance of my presentation tonight is the effort being made to develop a coherent body of theory to deal with the relation between genes and culture. What we've tried to do is to align a previously neglected field, cognitive, that is neglected by the biologist, cognitive and developmental psychology, with evolutionary biology and particularly sociobiology, and to develop an ensemble of models that trace at times clumsily and imperfectly behavioral development from the genetic blueprint to the assembly of the nervous system, to the learning process, and finally in a breathless pair of leaps to cultural patterns and back down to the alteration of gene frequencies by natural selection. Let me introduce this complicated business by suggesting that a good deal of the division between biology and the social sciences has been a matter of perspective. I think we can see this best with a set of caricature of the situation that I will present now, showing the different views of human social variation, seen first by the sociologist, whose view of the variation, of course, is extraordinarily complicated and rich, as indeed it is. They stand close. And if we see this as a frequency curve of the social behaviors, imagine in a terribly oversimplified way all the various kinds of potential social behaviors as being along the horizontal axis, and the frequency with which one encounters them within societies, across cultures, as well as being measured by the vertical axis. And the sociologist stands close, very close to that variation, and glories in the detail of Bronx street gangs and the effect of dust storms on corn prices and divorce rates in Iowa and so on, which all are very important. But the anthropologist now takes a more distance view and says that yes, the variation is enormous. It's not infinite, though. The grail of anthropology, including cultural anthropology, is the discovery of governing laws by which that variation in cultural choice might be explained in a more deductive and rigorous manner. And the primatologist, that group of zoologists specializing on monkeys, apes, and other primates who are infiltrating the anthropology departments of this country, see the species as still a more constrained social entity, and note that yes, the variation in human social behavior is extremely great and complicated, but after all, it's just one of a number of primate species whose close scrutiny is fruitful in providing the kind of background and evolutionary perspective needed to fully understand human nature. And the zoologist takes the most extreme view, or distanced view, and says that yes, man is terribly, terribly important, but there are in fact thousands of social systems, and the human social behavior represents only a tiny subset of all of those social conditions that are conceivable and in fact have been realized. Here then is the problem. We know that this variation, which the cultural anthropologists and sociologists dwell upon, is relatively enormous by virtue of being culturally mediated. But we also know that it's under some kind of genetic constraint. We know that biology matters. We know that culture matters. It's become fashionable to say that cultural evolution is Lamarckian in extent and relatively fast, while genetic evolution is Darwinian in nature and slow. But exactly how are the two processes coupled? Well, the key to the solution, in our opinion, lies in shifting emphasis from the termini of the two processes, the genetic blueprint and the final evolution cultural product, and concentrating on epigenesis, that is, on development of the mind in particular. The reason why progress in the theory of gene-culture coevolution, the interaction of genetic and cultural evolution, has been almost non-existent up until now, is that evolutionary biologists have virtually ignored developmental psychology, which is a vast field in its own right, relatively new. Cognitive psychology, in fact, has emerged as a field fully independent only in the last 20 years following the break of the iron grip of behaviorism. And psychologists also, on their part, haven't appreciated the enormous potential of evolutionary analysis. So in trying to move through this entree that we have provided in very simplified form here, would you please be patient with my making a relatively technical point? Imagine that for each category of behavior, kin classification, rites of passage of a certain kind, the way of managing or handling tools, and so on, that there are a series of choices that are available, conceivable and actually in existence in the long-term memories of the members of a particular culture. And let us give them labels. One can even use an expression for a unit of culture, such as culturgens. In this case, we suggest it from the, as meaning that which creates culture. Let us start our examination by dividing the choices available, choices of usage available in each one of those cultural categories into discrete units. This can be something that is already quite natural, in fact almost unavoidable, such as choice between incest and outbreeding, or between the relatively limited number of conceivable kin classifications within a particular circle of degree of relationship. Those are innumerable, they are discrete. So our way of presenting the culturgens, the units of culture in this manner, is at least in some paradigmatic cases realistic. But even if the culture, the choices in a particular category are very complex, rich, and say rapidly expanding by cultural innovation, one can still divide arbitrarily and for purposes of analysis that array into discrete units. Now imagine further that we could determine the probability, the likelihood that in a naive individual initially, individuals would be, young individuals being socialized would be more or less likely to acquire, to be taught in the first place, and then to acquire by learning one or the other of these choices available to them. With this in mind now, we see that there are three possible patterns, large categories of patterning in the choices made across a field of culturgens by the members of a society. It's possible that the individuals have to learn a behavior, but in fact they're capable of learning only one of the choices. It's the only one available to their brains. This is the situation in the acquisition of bird song of some species, for example, the white-crowned sparrow. The nestling learns the song. It has to listen to the parents singing the song in order to acquire any coherent song. And in a relatively short period of time, it learns the relatively complicated song, adult song of the white-crowned sparrow. But that's all it can learn. It cannot, under ordinary circumstances, be taught any other kind of song. That kind of transmission, I guess you could call it proto-cultural transmission, can be labeled pure genetic transmission of culture, a contradiction in terms. And in fact, the paradox that that expression, pure genetic transmission of culture, engenders, strikes upon being understood at the greater paradox of nature versus nurture, and I think helps us dismiss the difficulties or erase most of the difficulties concerned with that fundamental distinction for good. The possibility that there can be a purely genetic culture, imagine a race of beings, is I think, an important one. Imagine a race of beings which has a very rich culture, song, scientific expeditions, complex division of labor, all of this transmitted from parent to offspring, maybe through elaborate teaching techniques, but the species is able to learn only one choice in each cultural category. The opposite of that possibility is pure cultural transmission of culture. And that's the straight line. Each choice equally available, each one equally likely to be taught, given a free choice, each equally easily learned. That seems like a strange, extreme possibility as well. And yet, intuitively, that is the tabula rasa mind, the blank slate mind that has been the source of a great deal of thinking in modern social theory and still persists in much of the social sciences. There's a third possibility, which we call the gene culture transmission of culture, just meaning, in effect, intermediate, meaning that many choices are open, many can be taught and learned, but some are more likely to be taught and learned, given equally free access than others because of peculiarities in the way perception is organized, the way the brain processes information through the intermediate stages of coding into long-term memory, summons the long-term memory into the short-term memory and conscious centers, and evaluates and makes decisions. To make a long story short, let me say that I believe that the evidence from ongoing research in developmental psychology, particularly with infants and young children, where these predilections, biases in development can be most directly discerned and measured in a culture moderated environment, a culture low environment. That in every case so far where such studies have been put to measurement and rigorous experimental examination, the transmission in human beings has turned out to be gene culture rather than pure genetic, of course, or pure cultural, and often with striking degrees of bias. Now, to show you what I mean, I'm going to start out with a case that really hasn't been put to a measure except in an indirect way through related cognitive studies, but it's so striking as one of many examples from the literature of illusion and sensory screening in human cognition that I think it's a good one to start to make my point. These portraits have been altered, of course, by having yes, thank you. We've missed a slide here somehow.
It was upside down and he's fixed it.
Someone fixed it for me. Oh, I see. Well, I should have told them not to fix it because that took away my punchline. Well, if you will all stand on your head. Is someone back there, can they possibly turn that slide upside down again? Is there someone listening to me? Thank you. Right, okay. Now let's start all over again. Back with the macrotermitine termites. Now this slide has been altered by having the portraits have been altered by having the mouths and the eyes excised and turned upside down, and then the whole portrait turned upside down. And I'm not trying to make a political statement. Good heavens, let me avoid that at all terms. I voted for one of these men anyway. I think that even though the portrait is upside down, that somehow you get the feeling that these gentlemen are smiling at you. That's because of your heavy concentration, of course, on the mouth and the eyes. But when you see the terrible truth, that is the portrait's turned right side up, you realize that, in fact, you have been doing a great deal of screening. And this is a tendency which appears very early, I should say, in the way infants perceive faces and the features that infants concentrate on and so on. But I want to turn from that to another somewhat less striking example, but that is visually striking, less striking, but nevertheless more illuminating example. It involves light that illustrates my point of or illustrates gene culture transmission. it's a peculiar fact of the perception of light that human beings perceive luminance, that's the intensity of light, as a continuum. So that if we were to raise or lower the intensity of light in this room gradually, that is the way you would see it. And it's very difficult for the human mind to crack that gradient into discrete units and to put a vocabulary on it. The vocabulary for the human vocabulary for variation in light intensity is relatively small. But on the other hand, the wavelength is broken up in the mind, in the brain, into four basic colors: blue, green, yellow, and red. We know the physiological basis of this in part. It has to do, of course, with the three kinds of color cones in the retina, and also the division into 3 or 4 categories of cells in the relay center and the lateral geniculate nuclei leading from the eye to the brain. And so this is no mystery, but the effect is quite profound that we see it this way. And studies by Mark Bornstein of Princeton University, using very ingenious experiments with disinhibition of infant gaze, has shown that, in fact, as soon as you can begin testing infants, they do also break light up into those categories. And here we have a measure of the ability to identify the colors, which falls apart, of course, in these intermediate wavelengths here, and the ability to discriminate, going from poor to good, peaking at the intermediate levels, as you would expect. Now, this simple pair of physiological devices has a profound effect on culture, from biology to culture directly. When Brent Berlin and Paul Kay at Berkeley gave a Munsell array of colors, which show the full color spectrum in little plates that go in fine steps, horizontally and in luminosity or in intensity from bottom to top, to the native speakers of 20 languages from all over the world, including quite a few that are linguistically not even remotely related, and asked them to pinpoint on the Munsell array where their various color terms fit intuitively to them, and then they averaged all the hits across those 40 languages. They found, perhaps not surprisingly in view of what I've just said, but it came as a great surprise to the cultural anthropologist 10 years ago, that the color terms do indeed cluster, and approximately on the 4 basic colors. When Eleanor Roche, also of Berkeley, conducted an experiment with volunteers of the Dani tribe of New Guinea, who have one of the smallest color vocabularies in the world, the results were, again, not surprising, but confirmatory of the relation between biology and culture in a very striking way. She found that when one group of volunteers were given color terms, arbitrarily designed words to designate colors on a Munsell array, within the modal clusters, which are congruent to the way we know the brain breaks color, and another group was given a set of arbitrary terms that are on the borderline in the zones of greatest ambiguity. Those volunteers who had the terms within the modal clusters learned the terms about twice as fast, remembered them about twice as long, and expressed much greater satisfaction at learning that vocabulary. When given a choice, Dani people, between the sets of terms, Dani people turned to the terms that fitted on the modal clusters. Continuing on. Again, with color, this is a very peculiar phenomenon, the circumplex, which was described originally by Roger Shepard at Stanford and his associates, Most of this work I'm mentioning is just several years old because of the great upsurge in cognitive psychology that relates to the problems that I'm now addressing. When people make intuitive judgments of the similarity, just completely subjective intuitive judgments of the similarity of different colors, that is, monochromatic light at different wavelengths, how close is, shall we say, yellow to violet, or how close is yellow to green, and they put intuitive measures, subjective measures on them. And then all of the matrix of comparison data are converted into a two-dimensional display of this sort. One gets this remarkable circular design. You would expect intuitively that this would be a straight line. There would be red at one end and violet at the other. That's the, a straight line across. That's the way the light wavelength is in fact distributed. But the mind bends it so that even though violet and red are at the opposite ends of the visible spectrum, we tend to think of them as relatively close, intuitively and subjectively. Circumplexes of this kind have been found in very recently in other categories of cognition where they have been sought, as for example, something approaching them in phoneme perception, the similarities of phonemes, and remarkably in the smell of homologous series of alcohols. The work of Robert Fance at Case Western Reserve and his colleagues of pioneering nature, which is only now beginning, I think, to be fully appreciated, was among the first to trace choices, preferences in very young infants in optical design through time. And it has been known for some time that, in fact, if you use one of several attention measures, such as length of gaze or the head turning rate as the object is moved past the infant, and so on, infants have a remarkable, virtually newborn infants as well, have a remarkable tendency to discriminate and show preference. And Fance and his associates have shown that these patterns change through time. As for example, this steady decline of a very irregular rectangular matrix as a preferred design or non-preferred design over these more irregular jumbled one. And there's a whole series, a catalog building now of these preferences to show infant aesthetic and almost certainly an innate infant aesthetic calculus that is followed and which we're only beginning to understand. To keep your attention, keep you awake during this exposition of cognitive psychology, I call to attention the remarkable similarity across all cultures of the basic facial expression showing emotion, and in particular the work of Paul Ekman and others has shown that the basic emotions or the basic facial expressions to denote the 5 emotions of fear, loathing, anger, surprise, happiness, loathing illustrated here, and that's Paul Ekman. Can be read with 80% accuracy between North Americans or Europeans on the one side and in this case New Guinea Highlanders who had just had first or were in the early stages of contact with Europeans, and each reads the emotions of the other with 80% accuracy. And we also find that when we take the species of animal most closely related to us, the chimpanzee, which is believed on the basis of various lines of evidence to have diverged, the pan line diverged from the hominid line somewhere between 5 and 20 million years ago, and biochemically, chromosome structure, anatomy, this is the species most closely related to us. We can read several of the most complex facial expressions, including the laugh. It's called by the ethologists the open mouth, bared teeth display, and carries with it a very human-like laugh. Ah, ah, ah. And it is carried on in the same circumstances as the human play laugh. If these comparisons, including those of a couple of quite complex paralinguistic communications of this sort, are indeed homologous. They may well be indeed homologous. We can read, I would just make a rough guess, somewhere across at about a 10 or 20% accuracy across to that species. I add that mainly just for your entertainment. We come then to the measure of complexity in itself. Work by a psychologist named Hershenson showed that the, and this is not unrelated to the Fantz diagrams displayed earlier, that infants prefer, newborn infants, very young infants, prefer figures with somewhere between 5 and 20 turns in the figure. We don't have more resolution than that, but there is some intermediate degree of complexity. That's a very early and crude experiment. A somewhat more sophisticated experiment has been recently performed by Gerda Schmetz at the University of Louvain with adults, using as her measure arousal in the brain indicated by alpha wave blockage as a measure of arousal. And presenting adult subjects then with various arrays of geometric design. The block on the left over here differs from the one on the right only in having fewer elements per block. The real difference to note is the increasing complexity, computer-generated complexity, of, increasing entropy actually, and breakdown of the strictness of design as you go from the top to the lower. So you're getting more complicated design as you go to the lower. And the maximum arousal is indicated by alpha wave blockage is at this level, the second row of complexity here. This is an early pioneering work on what one might call the physiology of aesthetics, and again shows the way to get into, at a more biological level, the choices that people make. And deep choices, not just spoken, intuitive, subjective choices, but even choices that can be measured even by a physiological, deeper physiological response. Epigenetic rules of this kind, gene culture transmission of the kind I've just indicated, have been demonstrated in virtually every category of behavior, investigated, as I said, in such a way as to distinguish choices among stimuli. This is a new field that has opened up, and I think promises unlimited opportunities for the future of the brain sciences and cognitive psychology. These that have been found so far include, for example, odor and taste discrimination, with profound effects on the evolution of language and cuisine, phoneme formation, grammar, many forms of nonverbal communication, mother-infant bonding, form of infant holding, fear of strangers, a very characteristic response which appears between 6 and 18 months, that is, it has a duration between 6 and 18 months, the phobias, sibling incest avoidance, and other. It's clear that the developmental psychologists have a veritable zoo of phenomena, and they are just beginning to discover them in the same way that the endocrinologists 40 or 50 years ago were on the edge of a veritable menagerie, unknown world of hormones, which once explored, unlocked a great deal of the developmental calculus and helped us to explain development at the physiological and anatomical level. I think the parallel here is that we are about to see the code into the assembly of the mind. Most of these ontogenetic patterns that have been studied up to the present time occur early enough in life, and they're so strongly marked and stereotyped, or both, as to suggest that they're genetically canalized. Put more precisely, by far the best explanation of their idiosyncrasy is that they're part of gene culture transmission as I defined it earlier. It's possible, it would be difficult, if not impossible, to account for them by purely cultural transmission in the sense that I discussed. And in order to dispel any notion that I'm trying to paint here a picture of man as a genetic robot, the epigenetic rules cannot be accounted for by pure genetic transmission. In other words, free will is preserved in the case of gene culture transmission. Well, in the interest of time, I want to defer the question of the form of genetic control of the epigenetic rules themselves. For the moment, let me say that it's no longer such a matter of serious dispute whether there is any form of genetic control or whether there can be any connection between heredity and these tendencies that we're talking about, as much as it was, say, 5 or 10 years ago. Heritability has been indicated by twin and pedigree analysis of varying degrees of sophistication and reliability, some of them involving rather complex longitudinal studies in virtually every measurable category of cognitive ability and personality traits so far studied. Many of these properties are involved in the epigenetic rules just noted. As of 1980, as reviewed by Victor McCusick and Frank Ruddle of Johns Hopkins and Yale, about 3,100 human genes had been distinguished and 340 pinpointed to a particular chromosome, with at least one on each of the 23 pairs of chromosomes. Some of these genes and chromosome aberrations affect behavior in selective ways, such as the major gene, to take one of the several striking examples, recently identified by Ashton and Vandenberg, that alters particular spatial abilities, but not others. 3 forms of spatial ability, but not, to be specific, 12 others put to the test. One also should bear in mind that the analysis of more complex genetic systems, polygenic systems, is now well advanced and includes the calculation of the number of loci involved in such complicated behavior as dominance and drug-aversive behavior in mice, maze, the choice in maze running in mice, and in the epigenetic rules of color preference in birds, and as just reported this week in Science and Newsweek, the choice of mates in birds. The short-range prospect is very good indeed for a much deeper understanding of the genetic basis of what Lumsden and I are calling the epigenetic rules in human beings. Now, let me present in a very simplified form what we view as the complete circuit of gene culture coevolution. This is reduced to the point of a cartoon, but perhaps it can transmit the key steps, the notion of the key steps as we see them most directly and efficiently. The filters here are the epigenetic rules. And the filters in the process of socialization, of acquiring a culture, allow certain choices, cultigens if you will, through more readily than others. The full torus here, the full circle, represents the life cycle of an individual. And during a lifespan, the number of cultigens that the individual is exposed to, learns, stores in long-term memory, reflects upon, and chooses among, may indeed increase, either through an increase in the learning experience or through the innovation, the cultural expansion of the society in which he lives. If the, now coming to the, so much for the effect of the epigenetic rules on which choices are made and the shaping of the culture, which I've been attempting to document in rudimentary form anyway, now for the effect of the cultural choice on the genes. If the cultigens allowed through prove to be destructive in the sense that they diminish individual survival and reproduction, then those genes that, which blueprinted the epigenetic rules and allowed the cultigens to spread will tend to lose out, and they will be curtailed, and the filters grow inward. If, on the other hand, the innovated cultigens, as the culture expands, evolves, the new cultigens prove to be advantageous over old ones in the process of cultural evolution, then over a period of a series of generations by natural selection, the
epigenetic rules become permissive, the filters as denoted here are eroded away, or they may grow in from one direction while being eroded in the other direction. So we perceive and find it difficult, in fact, to conceive of any alternative, that the genes and culture are inseparably linked in this manner. Even if we could conceive of, even if we could discover on Alpha Centauri a species which transmitted its culture purely by pure cultural transmission, a perfect a blank slate species, that species would also have to be under tight genetic control because it takes complicated genetic devices to maintain homeostasis and canalization in order to preserve a perfect balance in choice among cultures. Imagine, for example, having to have a color, a wavelength processing apparatus such that one is equally open to all such alternatives and learns every wavelength across a visible spectrum with equal ease. That takes as complex a physiological apparatus from color cones back to the final valuation process as complex or more complex than the one which in fact we know we inherit. Now, this modeling procedure that has been based upon such a conception is still very crude, but it has been based by Charles Lumsden and myself as faithfully as possible on what is actually known empirically about cognitive processes. With the aid of colleagues in this field, we have done our best, and in cultural anthropology, we have done our best to reflect in the assumptions we made, simple, oversimplified though they may be at the beginning, the actual nature of basic cognitive processes as they exist in human beings, as well as the effect of the surrounding culture on individual decision-making, the size of the social groups, especially in hunter-gatherer and primitive agricultural societies where these models might eventually be put to the test, the actual practice of socialization, and finally, certain aspects of ethnography. We have been struck, as I guess most model builders are, or people coming in and examining one set of phenomena for the first time through the prism of the methods and notions of another discipline. We have been struck on the one hand by the enormous richness of information available in fields such as psychology and ethnography, and on the other hand by the poverty of information in many of the most critical areas, such as the effect of peer pressure or observance of peer behavior on choice being made by individuals, the poverty of information in such crucial areas that of the kind needed, in fact, of the kind needed, we believe, to connect biology and culture, the study of biology and culture. We've tried very hard, nevertheless, to incorporate the best of these materials available in an objective fashion. And to run through very briefly the sort of procedures that have been followed, here we have a curve which reflects in two forms, a continuous curve for a complex case, a very simple two-part histogram or diagram of probabilities of learning of two competing cultigens in a very simple case. This might be the first step one takes in going from psychology to anthropology if individual human beings learned one thing as opposed to another with a certain probability at a certain age and then stuck with it the rest of their life. Or, alternatively, learned both cultigen, both choices, say incest versus outbreeding, learned both choices, lived with the memories and reflection of them for a period of time, and then at some critical point in their life chose one with a certain probability as opposed to another with that full knowledge. Unfortunately, human beings rarely proceed in that manner, and so one has to move on to a dynamical perception, but much more truthful perception of what is going on in the human mind, where choices may be made between cultigens, if you want to put this in a more easily visualized form, say incest, a form of incest versus outbreeding. And at each decision point, at each time that circumstances or reflection bring these choices to mind, or circumstances lead to the necessity of a choice in action, at each decision point, then an individual that has been preferring one as opposed to the other either stays with that choice or with a given probability goes to the other choice, and then symmetrically you have the option of going from the other state to stay in that state or go back to the first choice. So this is the way to begin reducing the information processing and decision-making procedure into a form from which one can proceed or translate, as we say, from decision-making, memory, learning, recollection, and decision-making in the mind to whole patterns of culture. Such decision-making procedures can be envisioned then in an entire society, and we've used a Yanomamo-kin relationship here just as a illustration of how one might in fact project dynamical, ongoing change in attitudes and culture in a small society such as the Yanomamo village in the context of the entire society's pattern of choice, where individuals are observing the choices of others and where his own decision-making process as measured by these probabilities of transition are in fact affected by what the individual sees. And it's possible, and here again we have only fragments of the necessary data from social psychology to see what the relationships are, but it is possible to devise sets of relationships or functions by which these choice patterns are being changed as the total in individuals as the total pattern of change in the society proceeds as part of cultural evolution. Out of this information, those two key steps, the transitions among the choices within a given category of culture, and the effects of the surrounding culture as classified by the total pattern of choice of all the individuals in the society. To go from that through those steps then to total cultural pattern, we arrive at what we call the ethnographic curve. And again, this is something that should be routine in cultural anthropology and studies of ethnography, but is not. This would tell us simply the proportion of societies in cross-cultural studies, the proportions of societies with different patterns of choice in each cultural category in turn, incest, kin classification, and the like. This is what you should be able to extract from Murdoch, but in fact the data are not yet complete enough, rich enough, to get these ethnographic curves, which are frequency distribution curves that condense or display a full array of cross-cultural variation. Now these ethnographic curves then can of course vary enormously in their shape, and they show the pattern of cultural variation, which is the major concern of the cultural anthropologist. It's a pattern that I think can be put in a quantitative form, and which in itself is extremely interesting, not only because it presents the total picture of what that variation might be for each cultural category, but this can be derived directly through these models, if they are valid, from a knowledge of the perception, decision-making, and other cognitive processes of the individual, and of the effects on that of total pattern within the surrounding society. In other words, the substance of social psychology. The data of individual psychology, cognitive psychology, the social psychology can be translated to the data, hopefully, of ethnography and cultural anthropology, and back again, and against a biological and evolutionary diagram, a background, with an understanding, hopefully, eventually, of the total coevolution between the genes and the culture. This shows, it's an imaginary case, but it shows the effects of altering, in fact, not to any great extent, two key parameters in individual decision-making and sensitivity to peer choices. As we go down from this row of curves here, we are increasing the bias toward one pattern of behavior as opposed to another, say in favor of outbreeding as opposed to incest. So as you go from here to here, we're biasing it toward this end. So more and more societies will be consisting mostly of individuals who've made that choice, let us say, who've chosen to outbreed instead of having a preference for some form of incest, to use a simple, very simple case. And as we go from left to right, or from back this way, we're increasing the sensitivity to social pressure. That is to say, the individual is changing much more rapidly his pattern of choice as a function of or in response to what everyone else around him is doing. And as you increase sensitivity, then you get this remarkable tendency toward bimodality. And the point I want to make here is the following. Aside from being, in theory at least, being able to derive the patterns of ethnography, of cultural anthropology, from this information of individual behavior, the theoretical prospect of doing this, the point I want to make is the following. It is often said that great variation in culture, the great differences from one society to the next, that is encountered and is the commonplace of cultural anthropology, that this great variation, that people have one kin system here and another kin system there and so on, that this variation means that culture, in fact, has taken over stratigraphically, has come completely to overlay biology, that biology no longer plays a role. But I'd like to point out to you that this can never be the case, for reasons that I argued earlier, and furthermore, that it is not just the variation that we have to pay attention to, the fact of variation, and the erroneous deduction from that fact of variation that biology can play no role. It is the pattern of variation, the ethnographic curve, which can be, in theory at least, predicted from a knowledge of biology and decision-making, I should say, and ultimately from biology. All of the curves that you see there are based upon rigid biological parameters. The epigenetic rules are rigidly determined, and yet each one of them out of this information, those two key steps, the transitions among the choices within a given category of culture, and the effects of the surrounding culture as classified by the total pattern of choice of all the individuals in the society, to go from that through those steps then to total cultural pattern, we arrive at what we call the ethnographic curve. And again, this is something that should be routine in cultural anthropology and studies of ethnography, but is not. This would tell us simply the proportion of societies in cross-cultural studies, the proportions of societies with different patterns of choice in each cultural category in turn, incest, kin classification, and the like. This is what you should be able to extract from Murdoch, but in fact the data are not yet complete enough, rich enough, to get these ethnographic curves, which are frequency distribution curves that condense or display a full array of cross-cultural variation. Now these ethnographic curves then can of course vary enormously in their shape, and they show the pattern of cultural variation, which is the major concern of the cultural anthropologist. It's a pattern that I think can be put in a quantitative form and which in itself is extremely interesting, not only because it presents the total picture of what that variation might be for each cultural category, but this can be derived directly through these models, if they are valid, from a knowledge of the perception, decision-making, and other cognitive processes of the individual and of the effects on that of total pattern within the surrounding society. In other words, the substance of social psychology. The data of individual psychology, cognitive psychology, the social psychology can be translated to the data, hopefully, of ethnography and cultural anthropology, and back again, and against a biological and evolutionary background, with an understanding, hopefully, eventually, of the total coevolution between the genes and the culture. This shows, it's an imaginary case, but it shows the effects of altering, in fact, not to any great extent, two key parameters in individual decision-making and sensitivity to peer choices. As we go down from this row of curves here, we are increasing the bias toward one pattern of behavior as opposed to another, say in favor of outbreeding as opposed to incest. So as you go from here to here, we're biasing it toward this end. So more and more societies will be consisting mostly of individuals who've made that choice, let us say, who've chosen to outbreed instead of having a preference for some form of incest, to use a very simple case. And as we go from left to right, or from back this way, we're increasing the sensitivity to social pressure. That is to say, the individual is changing much more rapidly his pattern of choice as a function of or in response to what everyone else around him is doing. And as you increase sensitivity, then you get this remarkable tendency toward bimodality. And the point I want to make here is the following. Aside from being, in theory at least, being able to derive the patterns of ethnography, of cultural anthropology, from this information of individual behavior, the theoretical prospect of doing this, the point I want to make is the following. It is often said that great variation in culture, the great differences from one society to the next, that is encountered and is the commonplace of cultural anthropology, that this great variation, that people have one kin system here and another kin system there and so on, that this variation means that culture, in fact, has taken over stratigraphically, has come completely to overlay biology, that biology no longer plays a role. But I'd like to point out to you that this can never be the case, for reasons that I argued earlier, and furthermore, that it is not just the variation that we have to pay attention to, the fact of variation, and the erroneous deduction from that fact of variation that biology can play no role. It is the pattern of variation, the ethnographic curve, which can be, in theory at least, predicted from a knowledge of biology and decision-making, I should say, and ultimately from biology. All of the curves that you see there are based upon rigid biological parameters. The epigenetic rules are rigidly determined, and yet each one of them, even though they have this rigid genetic blueprint, each one of them produces a broad ethnographic curve, in other words, wide cultural variation. It is the pattern, the appearance of this variation, as indicated by as displayed in the frequency curve shown here, that we must concentrate in trying to connect cultural anthropology, ethnography, in our opinion, with the study of individual behavior in biology. And just to take a particular extremely simple case, the closest we could come to where we could get enough data on the strength of bias in the epigenetic rules and enough at least anecdotal data from ethnography. This is the prediction of ethnographic curves for brother-sister incest. This would be the curve. Now, let me remind you that across the horizontal axis here in a society of, in this simulation, 25 individuals, in this axis, the number of individuals who choose to breed out, who have a preference for non-incestuous matings. They prefer breeding out. They prefer not to have brother-sister matings. And that is the number of individuals in the society of 25 individuals. And this is the frequency of the societies that show that particular number, or have that particular number at a given moment of time, who possess that choice. So if there is no preference whatever, in other words, they're indifferent, pure cultural transmission, total indifference, we would expect all the various societies, as you got more and more of them and found out what the preferences were, to look like this. It would center on, of course, the halfway mark, and you would get a very broad range of variation from one society to another, but it would be concentrated, peaked over the midpoint, 12 individuals preferring one, 12 or so preferring the other. But as we increase the innate bias, then we begin to move toward this very strongly peaked curve with very, very few individuals preferring brother, sister, and incest, and a great many of the societies, of that size anyway, having tribes or bands or whatever, having no one who prefers it. We don't have exact data, but it certainly appears on the basis of anecdotal evidence that most societies are closer to this curve than, say, to this one or this one. And from the data on development, which has been painfully and independently extracted, and I might add accidentally extracted, from studies of kibbutzim marriage patterns in Israel and from the minor marriage phenomenon of Taiwan, respectively by Joseph Schaefer and other Israeli anthropologists, and by Arthur Wolf and Jae-Shun Wang on the Taiwanese. From these studies, there seems to be a strong indication that when children are raised together, very closely together in the domestic situation during about the first 6 years of life, they have a strong aversion or a strong inhibition toward later sexual liaisons. And that is sufficiently strong, as indicated by the data from those two, shall we say, accidental experiments, to indicate a curve more of that kind. So who can say? You would not accept this kind of a match in biology or physics, of course, but at least it seems to be in the right direction. And it indicates in this one case where we feel we have the largest amount of data at both the individual level and the social level to make the whole approach plausible. We've conducted similar analysis on other types of cultural evolution. I believe that we've made it possible to proceed from data in developmental psychology to the ethnographic data of cultural anthropology, and thus to link those two fields in a way that can be incorporated into models of evolutionary biology, connect biology and culture. We're also working on ensembles of models and empirical analysis of the reverse process, that is, the alteration of gene frequencies and epigenetic rules by natural selection operating at the level of the cultural patterns, the remainder of that gene culture circuit. In closing, let me say that we're all familiar with the lament that science and technology have created not just a cornucopia, but terrible dangers as well. What's meant by science in this case is, of course, the physical and to a lesser extent the biological sciences. But the solution is not, as a few Luddites in our ranks have suggested, the curtailment of science itself, including sociobiology and the social sciences. Quite the opposite. The solution is to make every effort to extend hard science, value-free science, into the deeper reaches of human nature in order to provide solutions to those residual problems that defy simple economic and technological solution. The social sciences and the behavioral sciences are absolutely crucial as we come toward the close of this century. They lag too far behind the physical and the biological sciences, dangerously far behind. It's the peculiar clockwork of the human mind, I would like to suggest, not scientific knowledge itself, that is the source of our danger. The account I've given tonight is very sketchy, but I've been satisfied to indicate, and I realize too that it's technical and jam-packed, and yet it's mainly because some of the relations are unfamiliar that would make it seem more technical. It is not, really. It's quite elementary in terms of most of the conventional arrays of science one picks up, say, in biology, chemistry, physics here at Harvard in the elementary courses. But I've been satisfied to indicate just a few major features in what is still largely a vast terra incognita. Whether our particular approach works, whether a better approach will soon be devised, remains to be seen. But I hope I've been able to express in a reasonable way why I believe that the social sciences can be welded to biology, and why I think there exists a domain with enormous immediate potential for scientific discovery in the postulational, deductive, experimental tradition of the natural sciences. In other words, there is no boundary between the natural sciences and the social sciences. Thank you.
Professor Wilson has agreed to answer some questions. Yes, back there.
Does your concept of the cultigen assume a single cause behind discrete mode of behavior?
Does the concept of the cultigen suppose that there is a single cause behind what?
Behind discrete modes of behavior. For instance, a gene behind.
Oh, no. No. Obviously, each trait, you know, it's often said that, that it may take 1,000 genes to make a finger, but we come to understand the assembly of the finger by studying variation at a single locus initially that creates a particular amount of variation. You know, you go into it stepwise. And obviously, what we are talking about here in terms of a cultigen are the choices that are made, in fact, are first perceived by the human mind, and then can be made, the distinctions between one set of objects, of artifacts, of mythic conceptions, of phonemes or whatever choice among these. And that entails, just as the development of an anatomical feature or a complex biochemical process entails, a whole set of steps which start with perception and then go through with coding of the information, long-term memory storage, recall, evaluation, and decision. And there will undoubtedly be many genes behind each one of those. However, I don't want to leave you with the impression that, that these cultigens are just arbitrary chunks, you know, that we cut out for analytic purposes from a continuum as perceived by the human mind. That is not the case at all. If, in fact, the human mind operated with perfect continua, as it does in the measure of luminosity, or near perfect continua as it does in the measure of luminosity, if that were the case, why then it would still be valid to begin analysis, you know, by cutting off arbitrary chunks, telling where your measures are, and so on, and proceeding in that way. But in fact, it is quite apparent that the mind does discretize, break up into discrete elements, many continuous or near continuous actual sensory impressions, and color was an example. The tendency of the mind to form phobic responses, to form distinctions between outgroups, in-groups, and so on. All of the, a great many of the phenomena that the structuralists, the structural anthropologists have stressed, indicate that, in fact, the mind does tend to break in automatically into discrete groups. When we get down to deeper levels in the study of cognitive psychology, we may well find that there are such things as natural cultigens. It's not necessary for the basic theory to proceed, but if natural cultigens of this kind do exist and they can be defined, they will have a complex genetic basis, and they will also be provide a firmer ground for the development of the kind of theory that I've been describing. Yeah.
Yes, please.
According to the current model, where might the mind of man come from? That is to say, was creative thought the byproduct of some pre-adaptive adaptation that the brain was built for, or is it believed that it has some adaptive significance to us?
Yeah, what is the origin of the human mind? The human mind is the, in terms of this particular conception, the human mind, of course, is the great missing link. In the study of human evolution, we've gotten ourselves preoccupied with bones and when people started standing erect and when they got 700 cc cranial capacity and so on. But we need now to start concentrating as much as we're able with admittedly very rudimentary information, but nevertheless to start focusing attention on what the first steps in cognitive evolution were, kind of paleopsychology, if you will. And my own opinion, I think it's shared by Charles as well, is that in the early stages of the formation of the epigenetic rules, which would entail such things as the way an infant were held, paralinguistics, signals, and so on, and perhaps the beginnings of the grammatical rules, incidentally grammar, the postulate or the proposal that that there are deep grammatical rules seems to be gaining more and more support, that in the beginnings of this set of cognitive epigenetic rules, which must have been taking place, say, from about the time of Homo habilis, 750 cc brain, own up to early Homo sapiens, 500,000 years ago or so, and beyond, during that stretch of time, that the epigenetic rules probably were advantageous. I mean, they were adaptive. That's a good working hypothesis, that to hold something in a certain way, to signal and to understand it quickly was advantageous and so on. Although obviously, the way the mind is assembled now, the rules that assemble the mind, have provided a whole armamentarium of other techniques, intellectual devices, tools, and so on, that many of which are no longer adaptive.
Anyone else?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, please.
It seems that the studies which you cited showed that infants from widely varying cultures showed similar responses in given situations when they're newborn. Now, it seems to me that if you want to show a link between cultural background and genetic identity, you need to find infants from wildly different cultures that show different responses at the stage of being newborn. Is there any evidence along those lines?
Yes, there is. You're asking, is there any geographical variation in the early infant epigenetic rules? Is that it essentially?
Well, that would be something, yeah.
Yeah. Not very convincing. Certainly not in any of the higher cognitive process, such as language acquisition. There have been very few studies across human populations of that, but there doesn't appear to be anything very strong. Daniel Friedman at the University of Chicago has found rather subtle differences in the standard reflex measurements, for example, of neonates from different human populations, but the meaning of this is not yet very clear. I think that the enormous power and complexity of the epigenetic rules themselves, even where they're beginning back with the infant, and of course the emphasis is now increasingly among child psychologists and in popular press too, of the so-called competent infant, the notion, that infants learn extremely quickly, their learning is often very directed and so on, that those are so powerful and complex, even among very young infants, that that's a species-wide trait, and that tends to override relatively minor individual differences.
One last question.
Yeah.
Back there.
Professor Wilson, with cultigens, I'm having some trouble understanding them because if you make the definition wide enough or vague enough, you can pretty much cover everything. So I was wondering at first if you could tell me by what criterion something is a cultigen and is not a cultigen.
Yeah.
And also, what sort of evidence would lead you to believe that your postulate of cultigens existing is false? How would you go about it with deeper evidence?
Well, you see, we haven't made any particular postulate about cultigen. That is, we haven't yet said that we think cultigens have a such and such a character in the way that you might say genes have such and such a character. At the moment, we're simply observing and this can be directly and objectively observed, the outer phenotype, the behavior that actually takes place, the color classifications that occur, the kin classifications, the choice between incest and outbreeding and so on. Those are the arrays of data. Those are the phenomena. And having observed the variation, we are analyzing the variation by breaking them up into discrete units, and that you can break it up into two units initially, or a large number of units, in order to proceed with the analysis of the effects of choosing one segment of that variation or another. Now, if we were to stick with behavior patterns, which are so complex and nearly continuous that we would always have to make arbitrary decisions in this way, then it would be very difficult, I think, to get down to a robust, a set of really robust findings. Although I think very likely you could. I mean, you can describe cultural variation as a continuous function, and not even use the word culturgen. But to make the initial analysis easier, I think it's better to make it discrete and call them and use something like a culturgen. But it's not nearly as bad as that. Because we can begin with those paradigms, such as the codes of color classification of the choice between incest and outbreeding, perhaps kin classifications and the like, which are truly discrete. It's very difficult to imagine them enumerated in any other way besides the way, in fact, you do it. And I think we'll be on a pretty solid basis there. The parallel is with population, to some extent with population biology, where you ask the definition, what is a species or what is a population? Well, if you were to be defeatist, you would say, well, there are many arrays of organisms which are asexual or occur in different times of the geologic period and so on, for which a species definition is arbitrary. And therefore, we might as well give up. Let's stop even talking about that. But in fact, there is a subset of populations which are very discrete. Most people and most cultures would recognize them as discrete. They have common properties, and they allow then a fairly sophisticated and robust analysis of the species formation process. And I would predict that that will also turn out to be the case for culturgens, and therefore the culturgen for the moment to be defined as a unit of culture, of cultural transmission, which in many instances can be easily broken into discrete units by virtue of the underlying constraints of physiology and perception.
Well, I'd like to thank Professor Wilson for his willingness to come and speak to us tonight, and I bid you all good evening.